Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
So imagine, if you will, a 14th century monk
Right.
just sitting there in absolute silence.
Right.
And he's staring at his own torso until he genuinely believes he is like physically blinded by the very light of God.
It's an intense image. Yeah.
It really is. And now take that image and contrast it with a devastating inferno, like a modern catastrophic fire that wipes an entire 20th century metropolis completely off the map.
Leaving just, smoke and rubble.
Exactly. Nothing but rubble and this desperate need to rebuild. So today we are asking you to look at the city of Thessaloniki in Greece, not just as, well, a collection of concrete and glass and asphalt.
Right, but as a living battleground.
Yes, a battleground of profound theology and, frankly, visionary architecture, which is the core reason why this deep dive is part of the project. The road has its own story, and in Greek, o dromos eki tidikito historia.
It is a remarkable way to view a city, actually, because we usually, navigate streets with maps or our GPS.
Yeah, just trying to get from point A to point B.
Exactly. We treat the urban environment as this static physical reality. But the spaces we inhabit, they're forged in the fires of human experience.
Both the internal and the external.
Right. The invisible struggles of the mind and the highly visible struggles of urban survival.
So we are going to explore the soul of Thessaloniki by looking at two master architects. And I'm using that term a bit metaphorically for the first guy.
Just a bit.
Right. Because we are looking at a monk who built the city's spiritual framework in the 1300s, and then a literal architect who physically rebuilt its streets from the ashes in the 1920s.
We're talking about Grigoriou Palamas and Alexandros Tzonis.
Exactly. Because to understand the physical pavement you might walk on today, you really have to understand the invisible spiritual battles of the past.
And to find the origins of those battles, we need to step back. Way back to the year 1296 in Constantinople.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah, and this wasn't some humble ascetic beginning. The man who had become Grigoriou Palamas was born into an incredibly elite environment.
Right, his family was aristocratic. I mean, they had these very deep, entrenched ties to the imperial court.
Yes, the court of the Byzantine Emperor Andronicus II Palaiologos.
So, to be clear for everyone listening, we aren't talking about some grassroots, peasant uprising type of figure here.
No, far from.
This is someone who was inside the halls of power from day one.
Palamas was effectively groomed from birth to be a high-ranking civil servant, like a real power broker in the empire.
And his education reflected that, right?
Oh, absolutely. The education he received was tailored for that exact destiny. He was tutored by a brilliant, highly influential scholar named Theodore Metochites.
Wow.
And under Metochites, Palamas didn't just casually read the classics. He achieved absolute mastery over the works of Aristotle.
So we are talking rigorous training here.
Extreme rigor, formal logic, physics, rhetoric. He possessed the most formidable, rational, and classical education that aristocratic wealth could possibly secure.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because his next move, well, it makes zero sense on paper.
It really doesn't.
It's like imagine a modern-day Ivy League valedictorian, someone who has this massive corner office on Wall Street just waiting for them.
Right.
And suddenly, they ditch the entire corporate ladder to go live off-grid in a cabin in the woods.
That is pretty much exactly what happened.
Because instead of taking that lucrative, incredibly powerful government job, Palamas packs up, leaves the imperial capital, and heads to Mount Athos.
Mount Athos being, of course, that remote, rugged peninsula in Greece.
Famous for its fiercely isolated monastic communities.
Right. So he goes there to become a monk, completely immersing himself in this spiritual movement known as Hesychasm.
But why? Like, why would someone whose entire brain has been hardwired by strict Aristotelian logic completely abandon all of that for silent moan mysticism?
Well, the shift seems jarring, but it points to a very profound realization Palamas had, which is that logic has limits.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Aristotelian logic is a brilliant tool for categorizing the natural world, right? For debating politics, for managing an empire.
Sure, practical stuff.
But Palamas came to believe it hits a hard, impenetrable wall when it comes to the divine. You can't logic your way to God.
So hesychasm was his alternative.
Exactly. And the word derives from the Greek word hesychia, which means quietness or stillness.
But it wasn't just sitting quietly, was it?
No, not at all. It was a rigorous, exhausting method of constant interior contemplation. The foundational practice was this perpetual prayer of the heart.
What does that actually look like in practice, like for these monks on the mountain?
It involves rhythmic breathing, specific physical postures, often sitting with the chin resting heavily on the chest,
Uh,
and focusing the gaze inward toward the heart or the navel while doing this ceaseless internal recitation of the Jesus prayer.
which is, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me.
Right. And the goal of this physical and mental immersion wasn't to merely think about God.
Because thinking is just more logic.
Exactly. For the Hesychast monks, knowing the divine couldn't be achieved by reading a book or deducing some clever philosophical syllogism. True knowledge required direct experience.
Direct contact.
Yes. They believed this intense discipline could lead a human being to literal experiential communion with the divine.
Which sets the stage perfectly for our antagonist. Or, well, let's call him the ultimate philosophical sparring partner.
Barlaam the Calabrian.
Right. So around 1330, Barlaam arrives in Byzantium.
And he is a fascinating figure in his own right. Barlaam was a Greek monk from southern Italy.
Which means he had a very different background.
Very different. He was steeped in the scholastic theology that was booming in the Western intellectual world at the time.
And scholasticism was all about logic, dialectics, rational deduction.
Exactly. Barlaam fundamentally believed that the essence of God is completely unknowable through direct human experience.
In his view, you simply cannot bypass the rational mind to touch the divine.
Right.
So when Barlaam travels to Mount Athos and actually observes what these Hesychast monks are doing, he is utterly appalled.
Oh, he hates it.
He listens to their breathing techniques, he watches their physical postures, and he openly mocks them.
He even coins a derogatory term for them.
Yeah, amphilopsychoi, which roughly translates to navel gazers.
Right. He thinks they are just completely delusional.
But the mockery turns into a full-blown theological crisis over one very specific claim the Hesychasts make.
The claim of seeing the uncreated light of Tabor.
Let's explain that, because it's a big deal.
It is. The monks asserted that during the deepest, most profound states of their prayer, they could physically see the exact same divine light that the apostles witnessed.
Radiating from Jesus during his transfiguration on Mount Tabor.
Yes.
So Barlaam hears this and immediately hits the panic button. He declares it polytheistic heresy.
He does.
And here's where it gets really interesting for me. Because wasn't Barlaam kind of right to be skeptical?
How so?
I mean, claiming to physically see a blinding divine light sounds incredibly suspect.
From a rational perspective, sure.
Like, if I tell you I meditated so hard yesterday that I saw a glowing, unearthly aura in my living room, you'd probably tell me to drink a glass of water and take a nap.
I probably would, yeah.
So if we look at this through Barlaam's highly educated lens, he's reading the theological recipe book and saying, look, the text says this is the formula.
While Palamas is insisting, put down the recipe book, you have to actually taste the food.
Exactly.
And that tension you're pointing out is exactly what threatened to tear the church apart. Because Barlaam's logic was mathematically strict.
Walk us through his argument.
He argued, okay, God is invisible and eternal. Therefore, if you claim to see a physical, visible light, and you call that light God, you are positing the existence of a second eternal entity alongside the invisible God.
Invisible God plus visible divine light equals two gods. Polytheism.
Exactly. It's an airtight logical trap.
So how does Palamas escape it?
What's fascinating here is that Palamas does not reject logic to escape the trap.
He doesn't just say, you wouldn't understand, it's mystical.
No, not at all. He actually leverages his elite Aristotelian training to outmaneuver Barlaam. Palamas introduces this highly nuanced, brilliant theological framework.
And this framework hinges on an absolute distinction between God's essence and God's energies.
Yes. In Greek, the essence is the ousia and the energies are the energies.
Let's break those two concepts down, because this is really the crux of the entire conflict.
Right. So Palamas actually concedes Barlaam's main point regarding the essence. He agrees that God's ousia, the true, inner, infinite nature of the divine, is completely beyond human comprehension.
It's unapproachable.
Unapproachable. We can never know it or see it.
It's like trying to touch the core of the sun. You just can't do it. You'd be vaporized long before you got there.
That analogy captures the mechanics of his argument perfectly. You cannot touch the core of the sun, but you absolutely can feel the sun's heat on your skin.
Right?
You can see the light it casts onto the world. And those external manifestations, those are the sun's energies.
Ah, okay.
They aren't some separate secondary creation. They are the sun itself, just extending outward into the solar system.
So Palamas applies that logic to the monks.
He does. He argues that the uncreated light the monks were seeing wasn't a hallucination, and it definitely wasn't a second God. It was the uncreated energies of God.
So humans can physically and spiritually interact with, experience, and participate in these energies, even while the essence of God remains a total mystery.
Exactly.
I mean, that is an unbelievable intellectual judo move.
It really is.
He completely validates the physical, mystical experience of the monks without violating the strict monotheistic rules of their religion.
And the ripple effects of this argument were massive. We are not just talking about a polite academic debate over a cup of tea here.
Definitely not. It resulted in a series of huge, highly publicized church synods.
These massive theological trials held in Constantinople in 1341, 1347, and 1351.
And in the end, Palamas's theology of essence and energies won. It became the core official doctrine of the Orthodox Church.
But, you know, the historical reality is that this profound debate about inner stillness and uncreated divine light, it was happening against a backdrop of absolute bloody chaos.
Yes, the disconnect is wild. The Byzantine Empire was basically tearing itself apart in a brutal civil war at the exact same time.
Yeah.
While Palamas and Barlaam are debating the quiet prayer of the heart, the streets outside are effectively a war zone.
You have John Cantacuzenios fighting a bitter war against the regents of the Empress Anna of Savoy.
Can you explain the dynamics of this civil war for us? Because looking at the sources, it sounds incredibly complicated.
It was. To understand a civil war, you have to look at the class divisions within the shrinking Byzantine Empire.
Right.
John Cantacuzenios represented the ultra-wealthy, aristocratic, landowning elites, you know, the traditional power brokers.
Right.
On the other side, the regency of Empress Anna of Savoy ended up relying heavily on the lower classes, the merchants, and the populists.
The people who were tired of being crushed by the aristocracy.
Exactly. So religion and politics became hopelessly intertwined.
And this directly affects Palamas. Because when he is finally rehabilitated from some early political fallout, he's appointed as the Archbishop of Thessaloniki in 1347.
And he walks right into the buzzsaw of this class warfare.
Because he literally cannot get into his own city. The Zealots lock him out.
Yeah. The Zealots were this radical, revolutionary political faction in Thessaloniki. They had violently overthrown the local aristocratic leaders.
And they took control of the city in the name of the anti-Cantacuzenios faction.
They were fiercely populist.
And because Palamas came from an aristocratic background and was perceived to be aligned with Cantacuzenios, the Zealots viewed him as a political enemy.
Not a spiritual leader.
Right. So they bar the city gates. The new archbishop has to retreat to Mount Athos and the island of Lemnos just to wait out the political storm.
It really highlights how messy the historical alliances were. We naturally look for clean narratives, you know?
The mystics on one side, the corrupt politicians on the other.
Exactly. But the sources show a dynamic, shifting web of opportunism. Just to give you an example, remember Barlaam?
The logic-driven opponent of Palamas.
Right. Well, Barlaam was actually a protege of Cantacuzenios early on.
Oh, wow, really?
Yes. Yet, as the civil war dragged out and political winds shifted, Cantacuzenios ultimately threw his immense political weight behind Palamas and the Hesychasts.
It's all just constantly shifting sands.
Very much so.
Well, Palamas eventually does get into Thessaloniki after the Zealot rebellion collapses. But his cinematic life story doesn't stop there.
No, it doesn't.
Because in 1354, he is sailing to Constantinople, and his ship is intercepted and captured by the Turks.
And he spends an entire year as a prisoner in Asia Minor.
Which is wild.
It is, but his time in captivity reveals the depth of his character. Instead of despairing or becoming hostile, the historical records indicate he engaged in extensive, deeply respectful dialogues.
With his Muslim captors.
Yes, very firm but respectful theological dialogues. He discussed the profound differences and intersections of their faiths.
And eventually he was ransomed by Serbian merchants, made his way back to his flock in Thessaloniki, and passed away there in 1359.
And his impact was so undeniable that he was canonized as a saint just 9 years later in 1368.
So Grigoriou Palamas essentially builds the spiritual architecture of Thessaloniki. He provides the framework for how the divine interacts with human experience.
And his presence becomes an invisible pillar of the city.
But as we know all too well, cities are also physical, tangible things.
Yes, they are.
And physical cities burn.
They do. And few cities have burned quite like Thessaloniki did in 1917.
The Great Fire.
It was an absolute catastrophe. It started accidentally, but it raged for over a day, completely destroying the historic commercial center of the city.
We're talking about the erasure of thousands of buildings.
Over 70,000 people, more than a quarter of the city's population at the time, were left instantly homeless.
Including a massive portion of its vibrant Jewish community.
Yes. It wasn't just a loss of property.
It was the sudden, violent erasure of the city's physical identity. The narrow, winding medieval streets were just gone.
They were left with a blank slate of ashes and a desperate, urgent need to rebuild.
Which brings us to our second master architect. The man who steps into that massive void, Alexandros Tzonis the Senior.
He becomes one of the central figures in physically resurrecting the streets of Thessaloniki.
And before we dive into his background, there is a fantastic historical Easter egg in our sources that perfectly bridges these two men.
Oh, this is a great detail.
Right. One of the most prominent, beautiful buildings that Alexandros Tzonis designed, built in 1926, is located right on Grigoriou Palama Street.
Number 17, to be exact.
Number 17. I just love that.
It's a brilliant piece of historical poetry. The architect tasked with pouring the concrete of the future anchors one of his masterpieces on the pavement, named after the monk who defined the city's spiritual past.
So tell us about Tzonis. Where does a visionary like this come from?
Well, he was born in 1877 in a town called Eritrea in the Kozani region of Greece.
Okay.
And he didn't train locally. He was educated at the prestigious School of Fine Arts in Constantinople.
Which would have given him a very cosmopolitan view of design.
Highly cosmopolitan. And he moved his architectural practice to Thessaloniki in 1924, precisely the moment when the city was desperately seeking a new visual language following the fire.
And looking at the sources, he designed some truly iconic landmarks.
He certainly did.
You have the Hotel Astoria, built in 1926. This building later became infamous, right, as the place where the American journalist George Polk stayed right before his unsolved murder during the Greek Civil War.
Yes, a very famous location.
And Tzonis also designed the Grigoriou Palama, which the locals affectionately refer to as the White House of Thessaloniki.
A beautiful structure.
And then there's the Grigoriou Eritrea in 1929, named as a tribute to his hometown.
The Grigoriou Eritrea is particularly notable, actually, because it represents an early, very bold use of reinforced concrete, but dressed in the aesthetic of the Viennese bourgeoisie.
Which is such a unique combination.
And that brings up the most fascinating aspect of Tzonis' work. He absolutely refused to impose a single, rigid, uniform style on the recovering city.
Right. His work was this incredibly wild blend. The sources describe him mixing Art Nouveau, Art Deco, French classicism, and even throwing in Neo-Byzantine elements.
This was a real mix.
So what does this all mean for the city? Was Tzonis just like an architectural DJ?
An architectural DJ.
Yeah, just sampling other people's hits because he couldn't come up with a unified style of his own?
Well, it is easy to look at that list of styles and assume a lack of originality, but the reality is much deeper. Architectural historians refer to his approach as local eclecticism.
Local eclecticism.
And it was a deeply intentional, highly respectful philosophy. To truly understand why Tzonis' style was so vital, you really have to contrast the rebuilding of Thessaloniki with the earlier development of Athens.
Because when Athens was established as the capital of the modern Greek state in the 19th century, they went all in on neoclassicism.
Oh, they imposed neoclassicism with an iron fist. The ideological goal in Athens was nation-building.
They wanted to forge a pure, direct visual link back to the glory of ancient Greece.
Largely to prove their European identity to the West, yeah. And to do that, they effectively tried to skip over and ignore the centuries of Byzantine and Ottoman history.
But Thessaloniki, in the 1920s, was a fundamentally different beast.
Completely different.
You can't just erase Thessaloniki's history with a fresh coat of white marble paint.
No.
It's a city that has been distinctly Roman, fiercely Byzantine, heavily Ottoman, and for centuries, one of the most important hubs of Sephardic Jewish culture in the world.
And precisely because of that rich, unavoidable diversity, the city took a different path after the 1917 fire. They adopted the famous Ernest Hebrod urban plan.
What did that plan involve?
Well, Hebrod's plan introduced modern infrastructure-wide boulevards, rational street grids, modern sanitation.
The things you need for a modern city.
Right. But it intentionally respected and highlighted the city's layered past. It preserved the sightlines to ancient monuments.
Which means Tzonis was designing for a city where you literally have Roman arches, Byzantine churches, Ottoman hammams, and bustling Jewish markets, all sitting shoulder to shoulder on the exact same block.
And that is where Tzonis' genius lies. He didn't lack originality. His original contribution was synthesis.
His emphasis.
Yes. He understood how to design a rigid, modern, reinforced concrete structure which the city needed for safety and density and soften it.
By blending the styles.
Exactly. He would take an Art Deco facade and integrate curved Neo-Byzantine arches or ornamental motifs.
So he designed buildings that felt entirely modern, but sat comfortably and respectfully next to a 14th century church or a 16th century bathhouse.
He was building a physical environment that openly acknowledged the sheer complexity of the people who lived there.
It wasn't about creating a sterile, uniform grid that pretended the past didn't happen.
No, it was about honoring the messiness, the trauma, and the beauty of the city's entire timeline.
By utilizing that local eclecticism, Tzonis essentially ensured that the modern 20th century city visually respected the era of men like Grigoriou Palamas.
Exactly. The physical structures he designed hold space for the spiritual history that came before them.
It really proves that if you want to understand Thessaloniki, you have to hold both of these realities in your mind at the exact same time.
You do?
You have to understand the invisible, uncreated energies and the intense inner stillness debated by a monk like Palamas, just as much as you need to understand the concrete, eclectic, physical elegance of the buildings raised by Tzonis.
They represent the internal and the external, the spiritual scaffolding and the physical concrete.
A city requires both to survive fires, civil wars, and the passage of centuries.
Absolutely.
And that profound connection is exactly why this deep dive is a proud part of the project. The road has its own story. And in Greek, Odromos ekitidiki to historia.
It's a fitting title.
Because every single street you cross, every brick you walk past, and every ancient argument that happened on that soil, it shapes the pavement we navigate today.
Which leaves all of us with a necessary question, I think.
What's that?
Well, today, we tend to walk through our own cities staring down at our phones, utterly disconnected from the massive physical architecture towering around us.
Right.
And we are equally disconnected from our own internal spiritual architecture. So, if your life were a city, what would it look like?
That's a great question.
Would it be a rigid, perfectly logical, purely functional grid devoid of history? Or would it be an eclectic, complex mix of profound, unexplainable experiences and diverse, beautiful influences?
I love that.
Take a moment today to actually look up at the buildings you pass, and then take a moment to look inward at the energies driving you.